This is a very special episode of No Nonsense. It's a bit of a meander down memory lane. For many years, as host of Canada AM, I had the real pleasure of convening our now infamous Thursday morning political panel. Hugh Segal, Michael Kirby, Jerry Caplan, reunited once again. Welcome back to Canada AM. It's 20 minutes before the hour. It's Thursday morning. So, of course, it's time for our political panel. A throne speech next week. The government sending mixed signals. Let's find out what Michael Kirby, Jerry Caplan, and Hugh Segal have to say. Well, Michael, the throne speech, what do you make of it?
Well, I think it's going to focus on continuing to deal with pandemic issues, and in particular, people who've been hurt by the pandemic, with perhaps a lot less focus on the total impact on the budget or on government expenditures than the Conservatives might want. But since this thing doesn't seem to be over, and since there are an awful lot of Canadians hurting, that's where their emphasis should be.
Hugh Segal, a lot of talk about guaranteed annual income, an issue that you've been fighting for decades. Do you think it'll be there or not?
I doubt if it'll be there in a very explicit way. I think the government will want to keep its options open, and they will do, I think Michael's correct, they're going to focus on the kind of COVID support process and what can be done and has to be done in terms of public health and other investments. Then I think they'll make passing reference to presenting measures in the budget that will address issues around equality of opportunity and other things. They'll be very vague. I mean, throne speeches are the menu, and the budget tends to be the recipe. But there's quite a large Liberal constituency, both in the caucus and in the country. I noticed the United Church is holding a vigil. I mean, you can't get more liberal than any of that. And that's good. And so I think they're not going to shut it down, but they're going to be as vague as they possibly can.
Jerry, your thoughts on the throne speech?
Well, I think it's largely inconsequential to most Canadians who won't even know it happened and who don't know that there is this humongous media foofara. When Mr. Trump talks about false news, you should look at the media here, how it creates entire issues that barely exist for the country at large. But having said that, I know it is the great obsession in Ottawa and all the media flack who think they have to cover it. I don't think they have to cover every nuance of it. And I think the Liberals are in fact deadly afraid of having an early election, that it would rebound on them, that the notion of an unnecessary, heartless election in the middle of COVID could be a great, great card for the Conservatives and NDP. People will say, look at New Brunswick. You don't look at New Brunswick when you want to know how Canada's going to vote. Right. No parallel whatsoever. So I think I will spend the day reading and napping, as distinct from the other days in which I nap and read.
I just...
In that, he'll be like a lot of members of the Senate, I suspect, on that day.
No, it's in our chamber. We have to pay attention. I've just got to say, this just instantly took me back. Now, I know some of you who are listening just wondered, why the heck was she talking about Canada AM and it being Thursday morning and all the rest? I met with these three guys. I spent every Thursday morning with them on and off for at least a decade. Mm-hmm. We did every election night coverage together. We did so many these were the brightest political minds of the day. They came in every Thursday morning for 20 minutes. The show that went on in the green room was often more interesting than the show that went on camera, because in the green room, you actually found out what they really thought. But you know what? You're not doing a bad job today of actually telling me what you really think. So we just wanted to reconvene this, the Thursday morning political panel. It really was.
Well, Pam, let me just say that when I had the privilege with my colleagues of being on your panel, that is when I had the highest public awareness in the country. And Canadians, being forever polite, would stop me in elevators and say, aren't you the sports guy on Canada AM? And I was 280 pounds at the time, and I said, what would ever make you think I was the sports guy anywhere? But nevertheless, that was one of those great moments in my life. And now that I'm in complete and utter obscurity, I'm grateful for the chance to have been part of your panel.
Well, you know, and it's
The
still
funniest thing for me is that I've done a lot of CBC panels until I quit the whole game a few years ago when I got ill. And I've also done a few patents, and people do still come up to me with less frequency, but they do. And they say, God, I remember you on Canada AM.
Right.
Which we haven't done for, I don't even know, 30 years.
well, that was the 80s.
Well,
I'm thinking.
I have to tell you that the best anecdote I have is sitting on a subway train in Toronto reading a newspaper, and this man who in those days I thought was elderly, I wouldn't think he's elderly now because then I'd be included, but he comes up to me and he says, I'm really surprised, very stern voice, I'm really surprised you didn't say hello to me. And you're frantically thinking back in your mind, where have you met this guy? And I finally said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't remember where we've met. And he said, how's that possible? You're in my bedroom every Thursday morning.
Well, and I remember in our first panels, Pam gave us the following advice, because, we were serious policy guys. Michael was in the Senate. I was an advisor to a prime minister. Jerry was an executive director of a major political party. And Pam would say, just keep this in mind. Half our audience is naked and the other half is asleep. So don't get carried away with how important this is. And that helped us, I think, giggle our way through a bit on occasion when it was actually worth a giggle. And
It was
the only
really
appropriate
true.
response.
And I talked about what was in the green room, and that really was interesting because perhaps unlike today, I don't know, I'm going to ask you this question. You guys weren't that far apart on many of the major issues. You did have to represent your party's view and what they were doing. But when you were talking substance about whether this was a good idea or a bad idea, there actually wasn't that much difference on the spectrum. Am I just remembering that incorrectly, or Michael?
No, I think what has changed is and we've picked it up from the States largely, I guess, and maybe the UK, is the extreme partisanship which now prevails. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the three of us became friends, really good friends. And that doesn't happen very much in politics anymore, where people are just inherently personalize every issue and feel that if someone disagrees with you on a policy point of view, then you must not like them from an individual personal point of view. And that's true in Canada. We're not as vicious as the States, but we'll get there.
And it was true for the media as well. I mean, we did not suit up and become a member of a team like what we watch now with CNN or Fox or MSNBC or Fox. There is no fact. It's opinion. It's their own personal views. And it was very different.
We were ambitious and serious about our parties.
Right.
Yeah.
And it became necessary for us to, is pretend too strong a word, but to act as if we were monumentally divided and could never come together.
Right.
Somehow we didn't feel that as human beings. And as I said before, we went out together. We went out at least once or twice to a dinner with our wives, the three of us. And we used to say we did bar mitzvahs and weddings. And
we did do some of that.
We did.
I remember during the free trade debate.
Yeah.
And it was one of the interesting, it was an indicator of where the public was when there was excessive partisanship. There'd be parts during the free trade election when we would go at each other, hammer and tong.
Yeah.
And the switchboard would light up with people complaining.
Yeah.
They actually wanted us to discuss what was in the free trade agreement,
right,
what the context was. But our partisans, our headquarters are all excited because we'd gone at each other hammer and tong. When we did the opposite, when we take a chunk of the free trade agreement, something like water or whatever, and actually talk about with content,
right,
the lights would go on at the switchboard at CTV and say, well, why can't we have them go on for longer? Because this is the only way we're going to find out what's in the goddamn agreement.
Yes,
right?
It's
so that was part of, that's when I think it became perfectly clear that while partisans were watching, which is understandable,
yeah,
a lot of people were watching because they saw it as a legitimate source of information even from 3 different points of view,
Well,
which you don't get as much of these days.
and the other thing at that time, just to put it in the context, is these things did run Thursday morning.
Right.
It started at 7:40,
Right.
and it went to the top of the clock.
Correct.
That was 20 minutes.
Huge.
Sometimes it went longer. Now, if you can get 3 minutes of ice time
You're right.
on a major topic, that would be excessive.
And I used to say at the expense of my colleagues, when I was speaking, out doing a speech somewhere, and people would, Canada AM would be part of the introduction, I'd say, well, look, Michael's a liberal, and Michael believes, and he would say that these are our liberal principles. But if you don't like them, we have others. And then I would
Michael, I've heard you say that.
And then I would say unfairly about Jerry. Jerry is a New Democrat, and therefore he believes that there's no situation so bad that government doesn't have the right to make it worse, right? And then I would say about myself, and I joined as a member of the opposition. I was an opposition person. I used to say, you cannot trust anybody in government. Then we formed a government, and we kept that promise.
But I think that was part of it. I mean, of course, you took your job seriously and your work seriously and even your party seriously, but you didn't take yourselves that seriously. And I think that was refreshing.
Sorry, Pam, we did feel that we had a responsibility to also be, if not wise, at least vaguely serious sometimes.
Yes, absolutely.
I think I told this story on air that one day my wife, Carol, walked into her office and one of the secretaries there said to her, gosh, I loved the panel this morning. And Carol didn't even know she watched the panel. And the secretary said, oh, yeah, I never went to university. This is my political science course. I couldn't do without this. That was pretty flattering.
And it was.
And made you feel you had to be vaguely sensible. The other thing was that the parties, this was a pressure I sometimes felt. The parties expected us to be partisan, our parties. I'm sure that's true of the other two, too.
Yes.
We weren't just there to have a good time and kibitz and be fun and lovable, but that we were there to push the party line. And when we didn't, they got pissed off. I told them to go stuff it, but they did that for years.
When I used to defend...
Pam, the other thing was that we all agreed, if you're going to be on the air at 20 to 8 in the morning, and if you're going to get anybody to pay attention to you, you better be entertaining. And entertaining doesn't mean bombastic. Entertaining means explaining what you're trying to do in serious terms, but also having an element of humor so you can jab at somebody in a funny way, not in a personal way.
And still make your point.
And I'm convinced that our approach to recognizing the time of day, or as my guy who watched all the time saw me in his bedroom every Thursday morning, that our recognition among the three of us that we had to be entertaining as well was really critical to the success.
The word I liked was irreverent.
Yes.
Which all three of us like being.
I think that's true.
When Mulroney was prime minister for the first term and a half before I joined his staff, so I was always often defending what the government was doing.
Right.
And one of the ways that Michael would deal with a defense that I would offer, which I thought was deeply substantive and thoughtful and et cetera, Michael would say, let me translate what Huey means to say. Right. And then he would put it in his words, which usually may have been more accurate than what I had said to begin with. And then Jerry would come in and say, well, the problem with the two old parties is, et cetera. But that became, it was a good rhythm, and it was, by the way, never largely inaccurate. There was a measure of accuracy in all of it.
And you'd all been in different places. You had been in power, you'd been out of power.
Oh, yeah.
And so you could see it from those vantage points. I just want to go back a little bit. Huey, you always tell this story about, because I'm curious, we're talking about partisanship, why you all became what you became. Huey, you've just done a book about your own family history. It would lead many to believe that you might be more a New Democrat than a conservative, but you had a moment that changed your life.
I was very fortunate that in a classic kind of strategy, which you do in an election campaign, in a riding where you have no hope, John Diefenbaker in 1962 came to speak to the United Talmud Torah Day School in downtown Montreal. which was right in the middle of a very, very safe Liberal riding. It was Alan J. McNaughton's riding. He was the Liberal Speaker of the House, and it was about to become Mr. Trudeau's riding before the 65 general election. And why do you do that? Well, you do that because you have to be seen to show the flag. You get a high school full of parents and kids are going to be respectful because you are prime minister, even though you're down in the polls. And you never know how you may unnerve the other side simply by going to their one of their really safe. Yeah. But he came and he made a remarkable speech, and I was like 12, and I was just swept away by his persona, what he talked about, the notion of freedom of expression, the Canadian Bill of Rights, which had passed the House of Commons under him. Exactly. And so it became a salient moment. And I remember that very night, I went home and sat around the dinner table to my gang, my family, my grandfather, my Zeta, who was an organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and my father, who'd been a Liberal riding regional guy for Milty Klein, the MP for Montreal-Cartier, that I was so impressed with Mr. Diefenbaker, I was going to be volunteering for the local Conservative candidate. And then my father said those wonderful words, "over my dead body." So, some preteens have sex and rock and roll. I had the Conservative Party. So the commitment was totally emotional long before I understood what it actually stood for.
What it meant.
And then you're already in the box, so you had to stay there. But I'm simplifying it, but that's how it happened for me.
Okay, Mike, take it away.
Well, it's funny. I had just gone back. I went to the States, did a PhD, came back, was just started teaching at Dalhousie. And it was a provincial election in Nova Scotia. I was completely nonpartisan, hadn't even really thought about political parties. And it was an election in which the Conservatives had 46 seats and 42 seats, and the Liberals had 4. So it was a total lost cause for the Liberals.
Good balance.
And a friend of mine was a Liberal campaign manager, and he couldn't get anybody to work for him. So I said, "Okay, come on. I want to know how campaigns work. I'll gladly come do some stuff for you." So I ended up as chair of the strategy committee only because there was no one else, right? That's not because I deserved it. And due to a whole series of complete and utter flukes entirely beyond our control, we won. Now, the problem of winning under those circumstances is that immediately people think, "God, you must be a political genius. You really knew what you were doing." Which, of course, is categorically not true. And about 2 days later, the premier said, "You're coming. I've arranged for the university already to give you a leave of absence, and you're coming into my office as chief of staff." That was how I got started.
And you became the most brilliant Liberal strategist in Canada.
Ever. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, ever. Jerry, this is so funny. Jerry, how did you start?
Michael's is a perfect Peter Principle story that I've ever heard. That's quite wonderful, eh? You rise to a level beyond your capacity. But I'm sure you learned, Michael. My story is a kind of offshoot of Hugh's because of the ethnicity. I grew up in a large Jewish family in which, to my knowledge, this was by osmosis because nobody ever talked about it. I knew they all voted Liberal, except I had one wonderful uncle who called himself a labor Zionist and stressed the labor part as much as the Zionist part. In other words, he was a socialist.
Right.
And none of which had the slightest effect on me. The only thing I cared about in high school was, besides smoking and girls, was anti-Semitism, and for some reason that I've never understood, racism. Even then, it was clear, it was knowledgeable. We had one black woman in our class at Harvard Collegiate. She turned out to be Zanina Kunde, for those of you who remember the NDP government.
Yep, distinguished Minister of the Crown.
So those were social justice issues, but they were not partisan issues whatsoever. And then when I got to university, where I was I wasn't even an agnostic because I didn't even think about these things. I was somewhere one night with a bunch of other people who I hardly knew, And Stephen Lewis came up to me. This is 1957. This is a long time ago. Michael,
Wow.
you weren't even born.
I was 7. I was
That's
7
what we're
years
gonna
old.
claim.
I was 7 years old.
And said, look, I'm going out to meet a bunch of interesting people after this. You want to come? And he took me to the downstairs of Trinity Hall at the University of Toronto,
Right.
which was like a graveyard.
Yes.
It was gray and dark and awful. It was like being in a poor British university. And there were Terry Greer,
Wow.
who you'll all know, and Andy Bruin.
Wow.
who
Oh, my goodness.
Both became members of Parliament. And they and 4 others were the CCF to be NDP at the University of Toronto, period.
Wow.
And for some reason or other, it bit part of me that I didn't even know I had. And I stayed with them for the last 700 or 800 years, however long.
What do you like? Those are compelling stories, very different stories. I mean, it wasn't like you made this huge choice. But today, what do you think drives people to team up, to put on a jersey?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest problem is exactly the excessive partisanship in that it teams you up with people who are of a different point of against the people who are of a different point of view. So you're not teamed up in favor of something. You're teamed up because you want to defeat somebody else or you want to beat up on somebody else.
Yeah.
So it's entirely antagonistic as opposed to a positive experience. And that's what you really see reflected in the so-called negative advertising and the comments that people have made. And of course, President Trump has carried that to extremes that nobody would have believed was possible.
Right.
In his last year as leader of the party, Mr. Stanfield made a really, really interesting speech where he talked about the weakening of the political infrastructure, the political parties, and he didn't relate it to any intrinsic problem in the parties. He said too many people are staying away from political parties because they know in a political party, whether you're a Democrat or a liberal or a conservative, progressive conservative, you may have an issue that's important to you, but you have to compromise with other people because that's how a team puts together the sense of competence and coherence. And people are they're withdrawing to special interest groups.
Right.
And then he talked about how special interest groups and charities with certain interests get more appropriate tax consideration for their funding than is the case. And I would say now, when I look at the present Conservative caucus, and I note that 44 members have a AAA rating from the pro-life various coalitions across Canada, I think we have to accept that in some political parties, people are getting into politics because they see it as a way of advancing a particular concern about which they're very passionate. They have every right to be passionate. But the notion that they're getting into a political party because they see it as an instrument to serve the broad public interest, maybe a bit to the left or a bit to the right or a bit to the center.
Despite the fact that the last 5 Conservative leaders have said we're never going to raise that issue ever again.
But your question was, how do you get into politics? And why do you get into politics? So I think there's a little bit of that. I also think that part of the new digital age has produced a kind of, in our day, if you weren't actually working in the political process or a volunteer in the ridings, then you might have been working on the advertising side or the polling side. And that whole third area has grown massively in terms of social media communications and stuff. And a lot of people are drawn into the political frame because it's a great way to be in that business. And I'm not being critical of that. I'm just saying it's different.
It's a different
from
entry
the way it was 25 or 30 years ago. That's all.
Well, and the influence of it, I'm going to come to you in a second, Jerry, but we were talking about the throne speech at the beginning. The throne speech 10 days ago was a very different document that what we're going to see next week because the polling results came out and said COVID's still top of mind. There's been an issue, we can't go too green too fast. And it's all because of polling, not brilliant strategists like the three of you who may be reading the polls.
Yeah. Yeah, we were not without the abilities.
No, I know.
To let the polls give us a bit of advice down in one direction or another. To be fair, but it wasn't as intense a presence in our life as it is now.
Jerry, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I think it's an interesting question because I'm not sure exactly of the answer. I have lost a lot of touch with my old party, with the NDP. Age does that. Geography does that. I no longer live in Toronto. I live in a small city. But I say for the people I've met in this small city, they feel like I did many years ago, and I think they have a problem. The problem is their party never wins. So why do you join it? Why are you in it if power is the way you're going to implement your issues? So I came up way long ago in my MA thesis with a proposition that I've pushed ever since, which is that our real influence is being able to make the Liberals especially, and once in a famous incident with the Conservatives, when Hugh was the interlocutor between the Ontario provincial government and the NDP, how they introduce our cherished reforms by themselves, and we can then say, you see, that's what we're good for. I don't care for power. I don't live for power. I live to make the world better. And if you and Michael want to do that for me, because we have enough strength to convince them to do that, then that's enough for me. And that was for a long time enough for me. And because we're all old friends, I'm going to say that it's not clear whether that still works anymore. The NDP has been a strange animal ever since Jack died. When Mulcair took us into a no deficit election, that seemed to put a hammer to the notion that we were different from the others. And it makes it harder to say. If I have two teenage granddaughters, and I don't know how I would persuade them that the NDP should be the way they make life better.
That was always the tension in the party, though. Were you the conscience of the nation, or did you want power, and you couldn't really do both?
That was the silliest argument I ever heard. I would say to those who argued, of course we want power, I said, that's a good idea. How do you think we're going to get there? Since those of us who've been trying for 50 years have completely failed, what is your secret when you tell us we've got to go for power? What should we say that we haven't said? What should we believe that we haven't believed? So I never took them as serious people.
One of the things that
took me as serious people.
One of the things that I like to do when I'm lecturing in political science classes and stuff, and history classes, I say, we do have different political parties, and they do have strong opinions and different views, and and there's intensity there. But let's look at how things actually happen in Canada, right? So the great sovereign province of Saskatchewan brings in universal health insurance under a guy called Tommy Douglas, who's a Baptist preacher. Let's be clear, right?
Exactly.
The leader and the Prime Minister of Canada in 1963 is also from Saskatchewan, and his name is John Diefenbaker. He's not a Baptist preacher, could have been, however. And he said, well, we better find out about this. Yeah. And he got Mr. Justice Emmett Hall to do a report. And the report was about it, and it was submitted not to Deef because he was defeated in 63, but to Mike Pearson. And Mike Pearson then went about, by the way, between 63 and 68, never had a majority, not once, implementing Tommy Douglas's universal health insurance right across the country with a series of fiscal relations and supports for et cetera. So now it's the third rail of Canadian politics. Nobody can oppose it. But all three parties were necessary for that to happen and for it to become fundamental. So that, I think, if you think about the things that really matter in Canadian political life, you often have to get that kind of triple parentage. And then that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
But it raises the question for me, and Michael, I want to hear from you on this. Can we do any big projects like that anymore? Honestly, we can't even seem to have a national policy on how we deal with COVID or something. Those grand ideas. We had this discussion in the Senate at one point about a national energy corridor across the country, and it would all be negotiated with Indigenous groups and the provinces would sign on. I mean, everybody would come and testify at the Senate. And then when they were getting up to leave the meeting, they'd say, this is never going to happen. Right? I mean, you're never going to get provinces and feds to agree. Michael, can we ever have another national project? The Constitution.
Maybe, but it's much, much less likely. I think the last big national project was the Constitution, which was national in the sense that at least 9 of the 10 provinces agreed with the feds. But that's getting harder and harder to do because each individual provincial premier will play to his own audience, and even if he was of the same party as the prime minister, it's not at all clear that he would necessarily, because he was of the same party, automatically go along with him. And as I said, I think it's much easier today to tell people what you're against, as opposed to tell them what you're for. And the idea of going out and selling a positive image of anything has become almost impossible. And Jerry made reference to social media. I mean, it's social media that kills it, right? Because the forces opposed to whatever it is you want to do have a huge communications ability that they never had before. They can use social media to reach every corner of the country with huge volumes of people and comments. And so even at the embryonic stage, while you're trying to begin to get an idea out and starting to build support for it, you don't really have a chance to even get off the ground before you're being hammered. So I think the likelihood of that kind of national project, I said, look, the only reason the Constitution worked is that Bill Davis, as a conservative premier of Ontario, and Dick Hatfield was a conservative premier of New Brunswick, teamed up with a Liberal prime minister to make it work. But that was the work of 3 individual politicians, much more than leaders, and they dragged all kinds of other people along with them.
Well, or Peter Lougheed reaching out to René Lévesque, right? There was so much that was possible behind the scenes when, I mean, you've raised it, so I'm going to go there, which is social media. It's so hard because a fact is stated. Well, it's not a fact. A piece of information is stated, and it may be true or false. It goes everywhere. By the time you try to correct it or support it, it's too late. Everybody believes that already.
What's that great line that a lie has gone halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on?
Yes, exactly.
And that's even more intense now because of social media.
Jerry, do you want to pick up on social media?
Listen, I ran 1 national campaign, 3 provincial campaigns, all kinds of writing campaigns, and I wouldn't know how to begin today. I am completely baffled about how you intrude into somebody else's computer and how I find out whether you're intruding or not. That's an entire world that I can't grasp at all. In my day, we had 1 genius working at National NDP headquarters who seemed to know all of this, but nobody else ever had to do that. So I wouldn't even know where to begin to run a campaign, and I feel helpless personally. And I think the Democrats were helpless against all those who broke into their system. And it wasn't just the Russians, it was young Republican punks all over the place who became Breitbart and all that stuff. These anonymous groups who you've never heard of, who one day are credited with destroying Hillary Clinton. And God knows what they're now doing to Joe Biden and what the Democrats are trying to do to Trump.
Well, that's the thing. Everybody's using it.
Everybody's using it against each other. Do they neutralize each other? We have no idea. But it terrifies me that it's completely out of human control.
Yeah, I must say, I've been surprised at the general consensus in the political community not to do in a regulatory way about that stuff what we always did about the other media in a regulatory way. The Election Act was very clear.
Right.
When you could buy ads, when how much you could spend.
Balancing.
Etc.
If I had you
fair
on,
comment, the notion of fair comment.
Yep.
And you know, and from time to time, the regulator would act. But now there doesn't seem to be any will to engage because it seems to be too complex. I would argue, and this is an old.
I don't think it's complex. I mean, technologically complex. I think the problem is that, and Pam, you suggested it earlier when you said something was a fact, and then you changed it and said, "Well, this is a opinion or whatever."
It's a piece of information.
There is that if you start deciding that certain things shouldn't be allowed because they're not facts, then whoever is making that decision clearly has a set of values that are going to be reflected in those decisions. So there is no objective, non-arbitrary way of deciding what you eliminate. And therefore, unless it's extreme, people like Facebook and Twitter and others can't do it and won't do it.
Well, and the phrase made so famous is, there are alternate facts. In fact, yes. That's true. There are alternate facts. There are different realities. So you see the same event, the same situation through a fundamentally different lens.
But some alternate facts are simply lies.
Yeah, exactly.
And some are alternate facts.
Right.
Some are an alternate way of looking at things. The one of the biggest Trump negative contributions so far is to completely confuse that line. When his spokespeople, you just want to throttle them, I must say, talk about alternative facts, they're talking about lies. They're talking about lies he tells, knowing, who knows whether he knows or not, but they know it's a lie. And then they say it's not a lie, it's an alternative fact. And it terrifies others, opinion makers who are afraid to take them on.
I want to start to wrap things up here and I know these are impossible questions, but I do want to talk to you all and hear you all on leadership, not specific individuals necessary. You don't need to say whether you like the men and women running things. What do you think we need now in terms of leadership? What kind of person is it that can do this job? I'm thinking back to Reagan. Everybody said he was the movie star. There was nothing there. In a sense, he ended up being a good president because he could just present a script, tell a story, bring people along. Or do we need people that are more expert in very complicated fields so that they can pick and choose? Do we need to narrow down what politics focuses on? I know a lot of ideas there. Michael, jump in.
Well, look, the most important thing is working almost backwards is you better have a very good communicator because no matter what the ideas are, if the individual can't get them across in language that the average person can understand, you're going to have a big problem. So the idea itself can be complex, but its explanation has to be very simple or it can't be done. And unfortunately, of course, that leads to the possibility of telling lies because lies are the easiest things to put in simple language. And if you've got someone who's a good communicator and good salesman, he can very easily, as the president has shown, convince people that lies are in fact not lies, but the truth. So I don't think that you want an expert. An expert, in fact, is likely to be a disaster because the expert will want to get all down into the nitty-gritty of the details. The individual leader needs experts around them so that the ideas can be developed and they can know what they're doing. But Ronald Reagan's the best example of a leader who's a fabulous communicator, and that is really the single most important skill for a national leader or a provincial leader today.
Hugh, you and I had the conversation recently about one of the critiques or analysis of Donald Trump is that he actually can't express himself very well. And I was watching in the wake of RBG's death, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, he was caught. He was surprised. He didn't hear it. The reporter asked him a question and he said she was an amazing woman. She had an amazing life. It was amazing. She was amazing. And that was it. And we hear words like sad, good, bad. Yet he's quite a powerful communicator, even though the vocabulary is pretty limited.
Well, I would argue, and this makes Michael's point, is that his limited vocabulary probably forces him, whether you agree with him or disagree with him, to say things in ways that are likely to produce more disagreement and negative reaction. If you think about the famous quote in the Woodward book, mm-hmm. The notion that a leader would say, look, we knew this was a very serious virus, but I had a duty as president to address the seriousness, but also to make sure that people were bucked up, because as a country, we could beat this if we engaged. Well, instead, he expressed it in terms of, well, I gotta be a cheerleader. And that appeared to be as if he was purposefully, and who knows what the truth is, purposefully hiding something.
When he was doing what most leaders would do, is say,
on the other hand, he
rally.
was completely inarticulate in the way he expressed it.
Yeah.
So I think that's been one of his, but the other thing that I would say we need, and this goes back to my bias about people who I think have been very successful. You really need good communicators who also have a very heavy, sincere dose of humility. Mm-hmm. Makes a big difference. And I think of Ronald Reagan. I mean, Ronald Reagan would start some of his most extreme speeches with 20 minutes of jokes about himself, making fun of himself. Can anybody imagine Mr. Trump ever doing that? It's completely inconceivable. Bill Davis did the same. Other leaders have done that in the past, and Canadians look for that legitimate humility, so the leaders haven't kind of lost contact with who they work for and what they do and where they're from. And I think when you do lose that contact, that's when you get a huge chasm between public political context and what the leader's trying to do.
Jerry, on that, and I mean, you're both talking about authenticity under that ability to communicate it, but even authenticity has become a construct, right? And that's a little troubling. Jerry, sorry, jump in.
That's okay. We may all be on the same page here. I use a different word, a different phrase. I always was struck by Donald Thumper MacDonald's word about himself that he didn't have the royal jelly. Mm-hmm. And I think if we look back at the last 5 years in Canadian political history, you'll see exactly what it means. That man whose name I can never remember, who was the leader of the Conservative Party? Who was that?
Him.
Which one?
Wasn't there?
From Saskatchewan, Mr. Scheer.
That's it, yes. I can never remember that name.
Glad to be helpful.
Mr. Scheer, it's now seemed almost universally agreed, had no royal jelly whatsoever. Right. It came out in different ways. He never seemed to have anything important to say. He never stopped reading from a page, so it didn't seem to belong to him at all. And here comes O'Toole, not a great star in the political firmament, but within a month he has managed to get people to talk about him being an entire different entity from Mr. whoever he was. And I agree with that. I have no idea what O'Toole has said in the last month, but even I feel he has more weight and more substance. Not quite charisma, but he has something that allows you to think he could do it, where Scheer never had that capacity. I supported Mulcair way back when, because it seemed to me self-evident if you saw all the NDP candidates together on a stage speaking, that only one of them could move the next day into the Prime Minister's chair. And that was Mulcair, who had this quality about him, this royal jelly. So that's what I look for, but it contains the attributes that both Michael and Hugh talk about. I think it actually should be Hugh as the next Prime Minister myself.
Michael, I know you were trying to get in.
The other thing that we didn't mention, which is really critical, is that it depends on how the individual comes across on television.
Right.
And not what they're saying. If you really want to know how a leader is coming across on television, listen to a speech or an interview, but turn the volume down. And when you haven't heard a word they've said, ask yourself, whether you like them or not. The problem that Scheer had, and isn't that not his fault in the slightest, the problem he had was he had dimples.
Mhm.
And it's hard to think that anybody is being really tough and serious if they've got dimples, because it always looks like they're smiling. And no matter, there was no way he could have overcome that in terms of the image and the visceral reaction. I mean, Jerry puts it perfectly.
Mhm.
That's why suddenly he never felt Scheer was like that, and he has a different view of the new story.
But on the other hand, you've got the prime minister with most people reacting to great hair and that presence on television. I'm not sure that's royal jelly in the sense.
Some people react just because there's hair to begin with.
Yes,
From my perspective, that strikes me as a plus.
Sour grapes.
But go with that. I
Yeah.
mean, it does matter what you see on television. There's a comfort level. There's a connection. It is hard to lie when you turn the sound down, because then
Right.
people do make a
Right.
judgment on whether you're communicating something and whether that is real or whether it's a staged performance.
I never shared the view of the prime minister as a young, sexy, up-and-coming peer-like figure. I can never see him without thinking that he just had his bar mitzvah. You know, he seems like a kid to me.
Hard for a Catholic, but anyway.
Nobody's perfect.
Mike?
Yeah, but I'm just going. I'll just say this. I'll say this about the prime minister, and I've never voted Liberal ever federally in an election in my entire life. I would say that what he did represent when he took on Mr. Harper, who after all was a very accomplished political leader who had great strengths, was he was better able to express the country's desire for hope and change.
Right.
And however people may now think that was all cynical, I think it looked and appeared to be quite sincere then. And that's an important thing that a leader has to be able to do. You have to reflect not only what you believe in yourself, but what you believe the country really wants. And I think Justin Trudeau did that extremely well in 2015. And then when Mulcair decided that he was going to be a zero deficit guy, they were cheering on the Liberal bus because it gave the Liberals the leverage on that issue to say, well, actually, we're going to invest in some things that need investment where we're deeply underfunded. And that was very helpful to the legitimacy of his campaign, and his personality was supportive of that.
Pam, the comment Huey made about the way you have to come across, I remember testing some focus groups with some ads for a David Peterson campaign when he was premier. And we showed this one ad and a lot of people liked it, but there was this one lady in the focus group who didn't like it at all. And she said, she was pressed to explain why she didn't like it. And she couldn't quite. And then she says, I finally got it. He doesn't fake sincerity well.
And there was actually an expectation that he should.
Yes.
Sometimes the era passes the leader by. This happened in my life most prominently with Tommy Douglas, and we now forget that. He became leader in 1961 because he was seen to be able to bring to Canada what he had brought to Saskatchewan, charisma and excitement and firm policies that he understood perfectly well, and a way to deal with people on an individual and collective basis. And by the time I got back from Africa, which was the late 60s, he was already being described by the younger new members of the NDP as yesterday's man. That's when, for those who remember esoterica, that's when the waffle came along, because these were a group of young people who said Tommy was terrific in Saskatchewan, but now he's just out of touch with Canada. Although he was saying nothing different, which maybe was the problem. Whatever the new ethos of Canada was, and I guess it had something to do with the tumult in the United States and the killings in the United States, Tommy didn't reflect it. He was still talking to a group of farmers in your town in Saskatchewan.
Good old Wadena. Hugh, you wanted
I was going to say, I remember when David Lewis retired and Bob Stanfield got up to pay tribute to him in Parliament. And he said, don't be troubled by the waffle, Mr. Lewis. There's always people who disagree. In your party, it's called the waffle. In the Liberal Party, it's called the cabinet. And in my party, it's called the general membership.
Is that a true story?
It is a true story. It is an absolute true story.
You've told
It's a great Stanfield story.
It is indeed.
It's just been wonderful to reconnect. And honestly, I think it's a history lesson and a political science lesson. And it's also very instructive about what issues we all have to be thinking about in terms of leadership in our country and what we want and how we manage these. So you know what? I think we should get the oldies but goldies back again at some other point. You up for that?
Sure.
I'll find you. Thank you so much, Hugh Segal and Michael Kirby and Jerry Caplan. It was a very long Thursday morning session, but it was really, really worth it.
Thank you, Senator.
Can I take my nap now?
Yeah, you can have your nap now, Jerry. You can read and rest.
I don't want to read. I just want to rest.
Okay. All right. Talk to you soon.
Take care, guys.
You too. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, guys.